Texas Hill Country, spring of 1873. The sky was the color of burnished silver at dawn, and the church bell had not rung in weeks. Hattie Albright stood on the splintered front steps of the old clapboard church, her two children tucked close to her sides. Her dress was worn thin at the hem, and her boots were too big her late husband's, the only pair she had left. Behind her, the morning wind stirred the mesquite trees. Ahead, the road stretched empty. She had not expected help. Not after the fire. Not after the man who married her out of duty took everything and rode off, leaving her with a collapsed roof, 2 hungry mouths, and no mule. But help came anyway. On a sorrel gelding, wearing a faded duster and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes, a man rode into town like he belonged to it. He dismounted in front of the church, boots hitting the dust with a slow, certain rhythm. His name was Jonah Westfall. Folks said he worked cattle up near Marble Falls, kept mostly to himself. Hattie had seen him once before at the trading post, but never up close. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Someone said you needed a hand." Hattie looked up, her fingers tightening around her daughter's small shoulder. Clara was 6. Her brother Caleb was 4. Neither of them spoke, just watched the stranger with wide, quiet eyes. "I don't have money to pay," Hattie said. "I did not come for money." She hesitated. "Then why come?" Jonah looked at her a long moment. "Because someone should." That was the start. He fixed the church roof first, then the fence, then the well pump. Every day he showed up before sun climbed high, and every night he left just after it dipped behind the hills. The children took to him faster than she did. Clara brought him a dandelion one morning, shy and smiling. Caleb followed him around like a calf, asking about horses and how nails held wood together. Jonah answered every question like it mattered. Hattie kept her distance. She had learned the hard way not to lean on anyone too long. One afternoon she came out to find him splitting logs behind the church. Sweat clung to his shirt, and the sound of the axe carried through the trees. "You do not have to keep coming back," she said. He looked up. "I know." "Then why do you?" He set the axe down. "Because I want to." She stared at him, unsure what to say. No one had ever done something for her just because they wanted to. Later that week, the children ran ahead after supper, chasing fireflies near the creek. Hattie stood beside Jonah, watching the sky turn gold. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked. He did not answer right away. "I believe folks can become more than what hurt them." She turned to him. "You speak like someone who knows." "I do." She nodded once, the silence between them deep but not heavy. Jonah never asked about her husband. Hattie never asked what made him so sure and quiet. But every day, she noticed the way he carried himself, as if he had lost something once, too. The first time he touched her, it was not planned. She had tripped over a root by the well, and his hand caught her elbow before she hit the ground. It lingered a second too long, warm and steady. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. He did not let go right away. "You should not have to do all this alone." That night, after the children were asleep, she sat on the church steps and watched the stars. Jonah had gone, but his presence still lingered like the scent of cedar. It was not love yet, but it was close. A week later, a storm rolled in fast and mean. The wind howled through the trees and the sky cracked open. Hattie gathered the children inside the church, lighting a single lantern. Then came the knock. She opened the door to find Jonah, soaked through, his hat in his hand. "I came to make sure you were safe," he said. They sat together that night, the 4 of them, inside the quiet church. Rain lashed the windows. Caleb curled up beside Jonah, head on his arm. Clara dozed in Hattie's lap. Jonah looked over. "I never had a family." She met his eyes. "You do now." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, warm, solid, sure. "Hattie," he said, voice low, "before God and heaven, you are already mine." She did not speak. She just leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, her fingers still wrapped in his. And in the stillness of that storm-battered church, something old and broken inside her finally healed. By early May, the land had begun to breathe again. Wildflowers dotted the hills in quiet bursts of color, bluebonnet and Indian paintbrush pushing up through cracked earth, determined and unapologetic. The churchyard, once choked with weeds, had softened under steady hands and weeks of quiet tending. Jonah had begun carving a cradle for Caleb out of spare cedar boards, not because the boy needed one, but because he liked to build things with care. Hattie watched from the doorway some mornings, drying her hands on her apron, a stillness in her chest she couldn't name. He hadn't spoken those words again, the ones he'd said during the storm, but they lived beneath every glance, every shared task, every silence that stretched long and unhurried between them. One evening, they carried water from the spring in buckets, walking side by side in the soft hush just before dusk. Clara ran ahead, chasing the long shadows between the oaks. Caleb trailed behind, dragging a stick across the dirt like a plow. "You always work like the job's never done," Hattie said, shifting the bucket in her grip. Jonah didn't look over. "Guess I believe some things are worth finishing." "You think that's what we are?" Her voice was low, not testing, just curious. He stopped walking then. "I think you've built something here worth standing beside." The words settled into her like warm bread pulled from an oven, simple, nourishing, real. That night, after the children had fallen asleep on the floor of the vestry, Hattie stepped out to where Jonah sat on the back stoop, oil lamp casting gold across his boots and the edge of his jaw. "I asked Reverend Goss to send up word to burn it," she said. Jonah looked up, eyes steady. "About the land," she went on. "It still belongs to the church, but the bishop said if repairs keep going, they'll deed it over in time." He nodded slowly. "You want to stay?" "I want something that doesn't burn down when a man leaves." Jonah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I never learned how to ask right, but if you'd let me stay, not just to fix things, but for good, I'd do it honest." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat beside him and folded her hands in her lap, staring out into the dark. "I was 16 when I left my daddy's farm," she said. "Thought I was running toward something better. Turned out I was just running fast." Jonah didn't interrupt. "I never thought I'd have a say in who stayed or went. You do now." She turned to him. "You'd want this." "A widow with 2 young ones and a patch of land that barely holds." "I want you," he said. "And all that comes with you." There was no ceremony, no grand gesture, just the kind of truth that didn't require proving. Sometime later, as the moon rose full over the trees, Hattie went inside, lifted Caleb from the floor, and tucked him into the corner with his sister, covering both with the patchwork quilt her mother had stitched before the war. Jonah followed, unlaced his boots and laid them by the door without a word. He took the far corner on the floor near the stove. He didn't look at her when he lay down, but she saw the way his fingers rested close to hers. Morning came early, bright and warm. Clara carried a basket of eggs from the neighboring farm, while Hattie and Jonah rebuilt the steps to the chapel, hammering in rhythm. Later, as the sun climbed high, she passed him a tin cup of water and said, "I reckon we could use a preacher soon." He paused. "What for?" She met his gaze, lips curving just slightly. "To finish what started in the storm." Jonah reached out, and this time when he took her hand, there was no hesitation, no trembling. "I'll be here, Hattie," he said. "Every morning, every season. However long you'll have me." And this time, it wasn't just her hand he held. It was her future. The days settled into a rhythm that held, not because life had grown easy, but because each piece was finally where it belonged. Jonah rose before first light, hitching the gelding to the cart he'd helped rebuild from salvaged wheels and split planks. He drove the children into town while Hattie stayed behind to bake loaves for the trading post. Clara liked to sit up front, her legs too short to reach the floorboard, while Caleb kept his eyes on the passing trees like they might whisper secrets if he looked hard enough. One morning, as Jonah returned with the empty cart and a small sack of flour looped over his shoulder, he found Hattie on her knees in the garden bed beside the vestry. Her skirt was streaked with earth, and her sleeves were rolled high, exposing scars he'd never seen before thin, pale marks along her forearm, the kind that didn't come from farming. He crouched beside her, not touching, just close enough for her to feel him there. "They're old," she said without looking up. "Came from a time I don't talk about." "I won't ask," Jonah said, voice low. "I know." She planted another row of sweet peas in silence, the soil crumbling soft between her fingers. "But I thought you ought to see. If you're going to stand beside me." Jonah reached into the sack and drew out a folded scrap of muslin. "I picked this up from the miller's wife. She said it should keep the sun off your neck come summer." She took it from him, her hands still streaked with dirt, and didn't speak for a long while. That evening, while the children watched a turtle inch its way toward the creek, Hattie turned the muslin into a headscarf and wore it while she worked. She didn't mention it. Neither did he. Later in the week, a rider came down from Lano with news. Reverend Goss had taken ill. The bishop wouldn't send another man out till fall. Jonah folded the letter slowly, then looked to Hattie, who wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the doorframe. "We can wait," he said. She shook her head. "We've already waited long enough." It was Clara who spoke next from the steps. "Mama, do folks have to be inside a church to be married?" Hattie looked down at her daughter, then back at Jonah. "No," she said softly. "They don't." Jonah set the letter aside and went to the barn. He returned with his father's Bible wrapped in oilcloth. Hattie led him to the back of the chapel, where the wild roses had begun to climb the wooden posts, and the grass lay flat from children's footsteps. She took his hand without hesitation. "I don't need a paper," she said. "Just your word." He opened the Bible, not to read from it, but to place his palm over its cover. "Before God and heaven," he said, "you're already mine." Hattie didn't cry. She just leaned in and pressed her forehead to his, her breath the only answer he needed. That night, the children fell asleep beneath a sky so clear it seemed painted. Jonah set the lantern low and pulled the blanket over Caleb's shoulders. Hattie lit the last candle and turned to face him. "You never told me where you learned to carve." "My mother," he said. She was quiet, but her hands were never still. Hattie sat beside him, her fingers trailing the edge of the newly sanded cradle. "You think she'd have liked it here, she'd have liked you." The wind moved through the eaves, soft as a hymn. Hattie reached out and traced the line of his jaw, something she'd never done before. "You're not running," she said. "No," he replied, voice steady. "I stopped the day I saw you on those church steps." They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. By morning, the first beans had broken through the soil. The cradle stood finished by the hearth, lined with an old quilt Hattie's mother had sewn before she was born. Jonah saddled the gelding and rode out to the east fence line with Clara riding behind him, her arms looped tight around his middle. Caleb helped Hattie knead dough for the day's baking, his hands too small to press it right, but eager all the same. They had nothing left to prove. Only a life to live, and they lived it. Together. By early June, the heat settled deep, slow and heavy, like a quilt stitched too thick. The wind carried dust instead of relief, and the field stood still, waiting for rain that hadn't yet found its way west of Burnett County. Jonah dug a narrow trench behind the chapel for runoff, his shirt dark with sweat. Hattie brought him a dipped cloth to press to his neck, her fingers brushing his collarbone before she pulled away. "You're going to wear yourself through," she said. He glanced up, squinting against the sun. "Land won't hold if water keeps pooling under the back wall." She knelt beside him, dirt already smudging her apron. "Then I'll help." They worked in tandem, not speaking much, the kind of quiet that comes from knowing what the other will do before they do it. When the trench was done to Jonah's liking, he leaned back on his heels, wrist over his brow. "I've been thinking about building a smokehouse," he said. She sat beside him, knees drawn under her skirt. "What for?" "So we can keep meat through winter." "I'd rather you not have to lean on anyone else for it." The thought of winter stirred something in her. Not dread, not quite, just the sharp awareness that some things, even good ones, must be prepared for if they're to last. "There's a man down near Lampasas," she said. "He makes salt-cured barrels. I could write to him." Jonah nodded. "I'll ask the blacksmith for scrap iron. Might make a door hinge from it." A buzzard circled high above, casting a brief shadow over the churchyard. Hattie watched its slow arc against the sky. "You ever think about where you'll be buried?" she asked. Jonah didn't flinch. "Not often, but I figure I'd want it here." "Near the chapel," he nodded once. "Near you." She didn't answer, just reached for a clump of wild grass and twisted it from the earth. That night, after the children were settled in their pallet near the hearth, Jonah laid out plans for the smokehouse using charcoal and the edge of a feed sack. Hattie studied the lines he drew, the steady motion of his hand. "You always build like it's meant to last 100 years, she said. "I don't see the point in doing it any other way." She rested her chin on her hand, watching him. "Were you always like that?" "No." He didn't look up. "Took losing a few things to start building careful." The candle burned low, the room quiet but for the sound of Caleb's slow breathing. "I've been thinking about the schoolhouse," she said. Jonah set down the charcoal. "What about it? If we clear the back room in the chapel, I could teach from there." Clara's reading more now. Caleb's close behind. His eyes met hers. "You'd be good at it." "I'd need slates, chalk." "A globe if I can find one." "We'll find a way." She reached across the table, her hand brushing his, not tentative but sure. "I don't want to wait for someone to come fix things," she said. "I want to make something here that doesn't fall when things get hard." Jonah turned his hand so their palms met. "Then we'll build it, together, always." The next morning, Jonah rode out to haul aged posts from a neighbor's field. Hattie stayed behind with the children, sweeping out the back room and chalking letters on the wall with a bit of limestone she found near the creek. Clara practiced her letters beside her. Caleb drew crooked horses until the stone wore down. By week's end, the smokehouse stood square and solid behind the chapel. The first shelves were set inside, and the roof held through a sudden night rain. Hattie stood in the doorway, the children asleep behind her, her hands folded close to her chest. Jonah stepped up beside her, the air thick with the scent of cedar and wet soil. "You didn't tell me what you want," she said. He looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean? For yourself, not just what you're building for all of us?" He was quiet a long time. "Then, I want to know what it's like to grow old with steadiness, not fear, not running, just a life that holds." She reached for his hand. "You've got that now." The night air stirred around them, fragrant with the first signs of honeysuckle. "I know," he said. "Because of you." She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, their hands clasped between them, not as promise, not as question, but as fact. And in the hush that followed, nothing more needed saying. The life they were building was already taking root. By mid-July, the air had ripened thick with heat, the kind that hummed through the trees and clung to skin like damp linen. Dust gathered in the seams of boots, and the soil cracked where it hadn't seen water in weeks. Still, things held. Not because they were untouched, but because they'd been carefully, stubbornly built. Jonah had finished the smokehouse and set aside time each day to help Hattie clear a small patch of land north of the chapel, where the children could grow melons and squash come fall. Clara named it the corner patch, and Caleb took to watching for rabbits that might nose their way through the fence. One morning, Hattie stepped into the back room of the chapel and ran her hand along the plank table Jonah had fashioned from salvaged pine. She'd scrubbed the floorboards herself, laid out the slates and readers, and stitched burlap curtains for the small window above the door. The schoolroom was ready. Jonah found her there, the sleeves of her dress rolled, a length of chalk already in her fingers. "You're smiling," he said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up. "I didn't realize I was. Good to see." She dusted her hands. "I thought I might invite the Tilson girls and maybe the Pena boys from downriver. Their mother said they've been trying to keep up reading, but working the goats takes most of the day. Reckon you'll have a full room. I wouldn't mind that." Jonah stepped closer, brushing his fingers along one of the slates. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't come here?" "I try not to," she said plainly. "But sometimes I wonder what I'd have become if someone had looked at me like I was worth keeping. You know better now." She met his eyes steady. "Yes, I do." That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, the two of them sat at the edge of the porch while the children picked blackberries with stained fingers and a tin pail. The cicadas had begun their rasping song, and the hills glowed with the last light of day. Jonah shifted beside her. "I want to add a lean-to off the barn, just enough to keep the cart out of the weather. You ever rest?" she asked, smiling into her cup of cooled coffee. "I rest easier when I know things are looked after." Hattie leaned her shoulder into his. "You're not the only one who knows how to keep something." He looked at her then, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet recognition. "Hattie," he said, "I've been thinking about a place down past the creek. There's a flat stretch with room enough for a real cabin. Not just boards nailed onto old beams. A place with a chimney that doesn't smoke wrong and a room for each of them." She turned to him, her face unreadable. "I'd build it slow," he added. "Only if you want it." She didn't speak right away. "Then, you think we need more than what we've got?" "No," he said. "But I think you deserve it." Her hand found his, fingers calloused, warm. "Then we'll build it, but not for me. For us." Jonah didn't answer, just brought her hand to his lips and kissed the place where her knuckles had reddened from work. The first beam was laid by late August, raised with the help of two neighboring men who'd seen Jonah through his earliest cattle drives. Hattie cooked for them, and Clara brought water from the spring. Caleb followed the hammering with fascination, naming each board as if it were a living thing. The house rose slowly, not hurried. Each wall was measured twice, each nail driven with care. On the day Jonah carved the lintel for the front door, he etched their initials into the underside before placing it. Hattie didn't see it at first. When she did, she ran her hand over the carving and said nothing, but her eyes gleamed. By the time the leaves began to yellow and curl, the cabin stood finished. Smoke curled from the chimney. A rocker sat on the porch Jonah had built wide enough for two. Inside, the hearth warmed the front room, and the children had beds of their own with quilts Hattie had pieced together from scraps she'd kept hidden for years. One evening, after supper had been cleared and the children were curled by the fire with their readers, Jonah took Hattie's shawl from its peg and held it open for her. "There's something I want to show you," he said. She followed him outside, the air cool and still. He led her past the chapel and the smokehouse, across the edge of the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick. In the clearing beyond, fireflies blinked low to the ground. A circle of stones marked the foundation of what had once been the church's original garden, long overgrown. "I cleared it this week," Jonah said. Thought maybe next spring you and the children could plant something here, something that doesn't just feed but blooms." She stepped into the clearing, her shawl tight around her shoulders. "You didn't have to," she said softly. "No," he answered. "But I wanted it to be yours." Hattie turned to him then, her face lit by the quiet flicker of fireflies and starlight. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. "Not like this. Not in my own skin, let alone in a home." Jonah stepped closer, his hand resting at her waist. "Then let this place be your proof." She kissed him once, and it was not cautious or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that belongs to people who have walked through fire and come out bearing each other's names. They stayed there in the dark a long while, the hush of the land folding around them like a blessing. Years passed. The schoolroom in the chapel filled with voices each morning. The garden near the creek bloomed with hollyhocks and herbs. Caleb learned to whittle like Jonah, and Clara grew into a girl who could read aloud with her shoulders square and her chin high. The cabin never needed rebuilding. It was built right the first time. And every evening, when the last light slipped behind the ridge, Hattie and Jonah sat on the porch, her hand in his. The children's laughter drifting through the windows behind them, knowing they had made something worth keeping. They never left. And they never had to.